The history of quilts, especially for Indigenous cultures in North America, has a really dark past. Making a quilt or a blanket for a loved one or an elder, especially if it's filled with symbolic motifs and design works, is a great honor that you can give to somebody. If the colonizers knew about this cultural practice, which they probably did, and still gifted contaminated blankets, it speaks about the atrocities that all governments are capable of. There's no way to prove that colonizers who gifted the contaminated blankets with smallpox were the sole reason for the outbreak, but the fact that it happened and it was documented is just absolutely heartbreaking. I speak about reclamation of quilting as a process in my artist statement because it is exactly what is being done by Indigenous communities. We did not let the history of contaminated blankets destroy the cultural history of quilts, but instead reclaimed it by continuing the practice. I'm also trying to reclaim the side of tent cities by using the very material that conceals the issues in the first place. I am absolutely disgusted by how some people have reacted to Camp Hope in Regina. Those people who want to hide the issue instead of fixing the issues that caused it in the first place. And those people who do not understand that inside these tent cities are real people who are struggling because our system let them down. With quilts, especially in Indigenous communities, the motifs are usually symbols that tell stories so that these blankets can kind of pass on a message for as long as they're being used. When I was designing the tent, I decided to use the aerial shot of Camp Hope because I wanted people to remember the story of it and how it progresses. Obviously, we don't know how that is going to be for years to come, but it's still an important story to tell. So I wanted to ensure that when I created my tent, that the motifs I used would have been similar to what maybe would have been created, but obviously I used a modern approach. The colors I used are all of the tent colors and tarp colors that were in Camp Hope. The background I used was actually hunting tarps, and I thought that it was a good representation for the land that the people were living off of. When I first started cutting and sewing the tarpaulin, I definitely noticed how noisy the material was. My partner and my cats were just frustrated the entire time because all they could hear was crinkle, 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 crinkle. And it was for hours on end because quilting is such a long process, cutting those tents out, cutting the strips, measuring. And of course, it's a queen size quilt. So I'm having to lay it out. And the material is just so slippery that it was constantly just this struggle with this material. And I also kind of just started to think about how symbolic it is of what, the people living in these tent cities must be dealing with. On top of it, it's the sound they hear all day long. So if they're trying to sleep and it's windy, all they hear is this material crinkling day and night. And it's not just one tent, it's multiple tents that, and it's a constant reminder to the people that are living there about their situation. So by hanging the tarp quilt away from the wall and adding an additional tarp behind it, it's my hope that when people hear the sound when it moves, that they can kind of see the little tents and hear the crinkling sound. People can connect with the people that are living in these tent cities and what they deal with on a daily basis. Maybe the viewers of this piece can change their minds on the situation happening here in Regina, and hopefully for the better. So with this piece, I really do feel that because it does hit so many of the senses, so it does again hit the sound, the sight, the feel, because when you look at tarp, it doesn't it looks like a soft material, but that it's a very rigid material. Yeah, I definitely want viewers to resonate with their senses, to be connected with the residents of Camp Hope or any tent city. Just, you can close your eyes, you can hear it. You open your eyes, you can see it. You reach out, you touch, and you feel it. And I think that that's a little bit more tangible than people just discussing the situation, to maybe have a moment to have those senses of what people feel on a daily basis or deal with. Tarpaulin was not an easy material for me to work with. Every sheet does not have a straight edge. It's slippery when being cut, and it does not take well to being glued or sewn. All of my design choices for this quilt came down to how the tarpaulin was going to behave. Because there's no stretch or give to the material, it was very difficult to sew once the larger strips were added to the pattern. I had to use ballpoint needles as to not break strips of the tarp, and I had to replace them often. I also had to step away from all of my instincts as a designer and as an artist to make this quilt work. I love to create beautiful garments that people can feel whimsy with, but instead I had to be rational and put thought into my techniques and change my designs frequently. This piece was not only physically draining, but emotionally. As I researched and learned about tarpaulin, the message behind this piece became very important to me. I wanted to challenge myself with a non-traditional material that I don't normally work with, and so that's why I initially decided that I was going to work with tarpaulin. As I have a background in fashion design and textiles, I often source materials before sketching out a design. So this project was really no different. Originally, I was thinking of making PPE clothing or armor or something of that sort. But when I started to do research on tarpaulin, I learned about this film called Battleship Potemkin. It's a silent Russian film from 1925. And although it's hailed as a masterpiece, it does host Russian propaganda and was subsequently banned in many countries for how violent it was. In the first 20 minutes of the movie, mutineers on the ship are herded to the front of the ship for execution. The captain requests that the mutineers are covered with tarpaulin to reduce the mess on the deck. All we see are the feet underneath the tarpaulin. One even falls to his knees. The sailors who are holding the rifles begin to waver, and even with the tarpaulin hiding their faces, the sailors knew that there were humans waiting for death underneath. In a way, tarpaulin kind of saved the mutineers on that ship. The riflemen pitied them as they were being treated like cargo and not humans. Although it's just a film, I definitely started to think about people who use tarpaulin on a daily basis for survival. 100 years after that film, and there's still humans trapped under tarpaulin waiting for death. I started to think about those who live permanently under tents covered with tarpaulin, and recently I've been thinking about Ukraine, who has millions of people displaced who are living in refugee camps made out of tarpaulin. I struggled being inspired by a Russian propaganda movie, but then I recall a scene where the Russian sailors mutinied to save the other mutineers, like how there are Russians right now who are refusing to participate, even though it may mean death if they return home. Tent cities and slums, refugee camps happen all over the world, and it's happening in our city as well. It is why I decided to use Camp Hope in my design. I wanted viewers to think about our community, to remind them that this is happening in our home. I want people to think about all those who are helping the situation and maybe be inspired to do the same.